movement that I made into their bedroom woke them up, and they moved, and somebody screamed, "Call the police," and I said, "No!"
At 5:20 a.m. on November 5, 1989, two gunshots shattered the silence of an upscale San Diego neighborhood. When police arrived at the Marston Hills mansion, they found a successful attorney and his new wife dead in their bedroom, killed by someone who had a key to their home. But this wasn't a random break-in. The killer was someone they both knew intimately, someone who had once promised to love one of them till death do us part. The person who pulled that trigger was Betty Broderick, and her story reveals how betrayal can transform a devoted wife and mother into a vengeful killer. What drove Betty, a once loving woman who had sacrificed everything for her family, to commit cold-blooded murder? The answer lies in a web of betrayal that took nearly a decade to unravel. This is the true story of how family loyalty became family destruction, and how the American dream became an American nightmare. In 1965, Betty Broderick was everything a young man could want. A stunning college student from a middle-class Catholic family in New York, she had dark hair, bright eyes, and the kind of smile that could light up any room. At just 19, she was studying to become a teacher when she met Dan Broderick, an ambitious pre-law student at the University of Notre Dame. Dan was different from other college boys. He was focused, driven, and had big dreams that extended far beyond their small college town. When he told Betty about his plans to attend Harvard Law School and eventually Harvard Medical School, she saw a future filled with possibilities. Their romance was intense and passionate, the kind of love story that seemed destined for fairy tale endings. Have you ever sacrificed everything for someone you loved? Betty Broderick was about to do exactly that. In 1969, after a whirlwind courtship, Betty and Dan married in a beautiful Catholic ceremony. Betty was radiant in her white gown, surrounded by family and friends who believed they were witnessing the beginning of a perfect life. Dan looked handsome and confident, already discussing his acceptance to Harvard Law School. Betty had made her choice. She would put her own dreams on hold to support his. The early years tested their commitment in ways neither had expected. While Dan studied at Harvard, Betty worked multiple jobs to keep them afloat financially. She waited tables, worked as a secretary, and took on any job that would help pay for Dan's education. Their first apartment was tiny and cramped, but Betty believed she was investing in their shared future. She had no idea she was funding her own destruction. Betty's days started before dawn and ended long after midnight. She would wake up, make Dan breakfast, head to her first job, then rush to her second job, before coming home to help Dan with his studies. When he was accepted to Harvard Medical School after completing his law degree, Betty didn't hesitate to continue supporting him. She saw each sacrifice as another step toward the life they had planned together. Between 1970 and 1979, Betty gave birth to 4 children: Kim, Lee, Danny Jr., and Rhett. Even while managing pregnancy and caring for babies, she continued working to support Dan's education. She changed diapers with one hand while typing Dan's papers with the other. She attended his graduation ceremonies with their children in tow, proud of what they had accomplished together. By 1983, all those years of sacrifice seemed to have paid off. Dan had established himself as one of San Diego's most successful medical malpractice attorneys, earning over $1 million annually. They lived in a stunning mansion in the exclusive Marston Hills neighborhood, complete with a swimming pool, tennis court, and sweeping views of the city. Betty had finally become the society wife she had dreamed of being. The Brodericks were members of the most exclusive country clubs, attended charity galas, and socialized with San Diego's elite. Betty was known for her impeccable taste in fashion and home decoration. She threw dinner parties that were the talk of their social circle. Their 4 children attended the best private schools money could buy. To everyone watching, the Brodericks had achieved the perfect American dream. But in 1983, cracks began to show in their perfect facade. Dan hired a 21-year-old receptionist named Linda Colkina, and everything changed. Linda Colkina was everything Betty once had been: young, beautiful, and full of dreams. A former Delta Airlines flight attendant from Utah, Linda had moved to San Diego looking for adventure and opportunity. With her blonde hair, athletic figure, and infectious laugh, She quickly became popular around Dan's law office. At first, Betty didn't think much about Dan's new employee. Law firms hired young, attractive receptionists all the time. But Dan's behavior began to change in ways that made Betty uncomfortable. He started working later hours, taking more business trips, and seemed emotionally distant when he was home. When Betty tried to discuss her concerns, Dan dismissed them as paranoia and jealousy. What red flags would you have noticed? Looking back, the signs seem obvious, but Betty was living them day by day, each small change easy to explain away. Betty's suspicions grew stronger when she began finding evidence of Dan's deception. Strange phone calls would end abruptly when she entered the room. Credit card statements showed expensive dinners at restaurants she had never been to. Dan's explanations became increasingly defensive and hostile. When Betty suggested they attend marriage counseling, Dan refused, claiming he was too busy with work. The truth was that Dan and Linda were conducting a full-blown affair. While Betty was home caring for their children and managing their household, Dan was taking Linda on romantic trips to expensive resorts. He bought her jewelry, clothes, and eventually helped her get her own apartment. Office colleagues later testified that Dan and Linda made no effort to hide their relationship at work, often disappearing together for long lunches and weekend getaways. Betty's instincts were right, but even she couldn't imagine how far Dan would go to get rid of her. In early 1985, Betty finally discovered the full extent of Dan's betrayal. She found love letters Linda had written to Dan, airline tickets for trips they had taken together, and receipts for expensive gifts he had bought for his mistress. When confronted with undeniable evidence, Dan didn't apologize or beg for forgiveness. Instead, he moved out of their family home and filed for legal separation. Betty was devastated. After 20 years of marriage and 4 children together, after sacrificing her own career and dreams to support his success, Dan was abandoning their family for a woman nearly 20 years younger. But Dan's betrayal was just the beginning. What he did next would push Betty beyond her breaking point. Dan Broderick wasn't just any husband filing for divorce. He was one of San Diego's most skilled attorneys, and he used every tool in his legal arsenal to wage war against his wife. He filed restraining orders that prevented Betty from contacting him at work. He changed the locks on their family home without warning her. Most devastatingly, he used his legal expertise to restrict Betty's access to their children and their marital assets. Do you think Dan was protecting his children or punishing Betty? The evidence suggests his actions went far beyond reasonable protection and crossed into calculated revenge. Faced with losing everything she had worked 20 years to build, Betty began fighting back. Her methods became increasingly desperate and destructive. She left profanity-laced messages on Dan's answering machine, sometimes calling dozens of times in a single day. She drove by his new apartment at all hours, watching for signs of Linda's presence. When her anger overwhelmed her control, she would vandalize his property, throwing bricks through his windows, pouring paint on his car, and once even driving her car into his front door. Each act of revenge only gave Dan more ammunition against her in their legal battle. He presented Betty's behavior as evidence that she was mentally unstable and potentially dangerous. He filed additional restraining orders and convinced the court that Betty posed a threat to his safety and their children's well-being. Dan filed restraining orders and used Betty's increasingly erratic behavior to paint her as an unfit mother in court proceedings. Betty found herself trapped in a legal nightmare where every action she took to fight back was used against her. Meanwhile, Dan's relationship with Linda became more public and serious. The court battles were brutal and expensive. Dan had unlimited access to their shared assets and could afford the best legal representation, while Betty was forced to rely on court-appointed attorneys who were overwhelmed and underprepared. One by one, Betty lost custody of her children. First, the 2 youngest boys went to live with Dan. Then the older girls were removed from her care after particularly volatile incidents. As Betty lost everything she'd worked for, Dan and Linda were planning their future together. They house-hunted for an even larger mansion, talked about having children of their own, and attended social functions as San Diego's newest power couple. Betty wasn't finished fighting, but her options were running out. The final insults came in rapid succession. Dan and Linda announced their engagement while Dan's divorce from Betty was still pending. They planned an elaborate wedding ceremony at their new mansion, inviting all the couples who had once been Betty and Dan's friends. Betty was struggling financially, living in a small rental house while Dan and Linda enjoyed the lifestyle she had helped build. Betty's isolation was complete. Her former friends sided with Dan, either because they genuinely believed he was the victim or because his social and professional status made him the safer choice. Her children, influenced by their father and confused by the chaos surrounding them, became increasingly distant. Betty's family back in New York urged her to accept the divorce settlement and move on with her life, but Betty couldn't let go of what felt like a theft of her entire existence. At what point would you have walked away? For Betty, that point never came. Instead, she spiraled deeper into rage and desperation. The breaking point came during the final custody hearing in late 1989. Betty lost all remaining parental rights to her children, who would now live full-time with Dan and Linda. The judge cited Betty's unstable behavior and apparent mental health issues as reasons for the decision. Betty sat in the courtroom, watching her life disappear with each word the judge spoke. As Betty left the courthouse that day, devastated and alone, Dan and Linda were already making plans to celebrate their legal victory. They had won everything: the children, the money, the house, and most importantly, complete freedom from Betty's interference in their lives. On November 4, 1989, Betty Broderick bought a .38 caliber revolver from a local gun shop. She later claimed it was for protection. But protection from whom? Betty knew exactly what she planned to do with that gun. The early morning hours of November 5, 1989, would forever change the lives of everyone connected to the Broderick family saga. Betty's movements that morning were later reconstructed through witness testimony, physical evidence, and her own confession. Betty woke up around 4:30 a.m. in her small rental house, her mind focused on what she saw as her final confrontation with Dan and Linda. She dressed quietly in dark clothing, grabbed the revolver she had purchased the day before, and drove to the Marston Hills mansion where Dan and Linda were living as husband and wife. Was Betty's plan premeditated or spontaneous? This question would become central to her later murder trials, but the evidence suggests Betty had been contemplating this moment for months. Betty used her key, one Dan had forgotten to have her return, to enter the house at approximately 5:20 a.m. She knew the layout intimately, having helped design and decorate the home during happier times. She climbed the stairs to the master bedroom where Dan and Linda were sleeping, the same bedroom where she had once slept as Dan's wife. What happened next in that bedroom would shock the nation and divide public opinion for decades to come. According to Betty's later testimony, she entered the bedroom intending only to talk to Dan and Linda, to make them understand the pain they had caused her. But when Dan woke up and saw her standing there with the gun, he allegedly lunged toward her, shouting threats. In the confusion that followed, Betty fired 2 shots. The physical evidence told a different story. Dan Broderick, 44 years old, was shot once in the back and once in the chest. Linda Colkina Broderick, 28 years old, was shot once in the head and once in the chest. Both died instantly. The positioning of the bodies and the trajectory of the bullets suggested the victims were still in bed when they were shot, contradicting Betty's claim of self-defense. Betty stood in that bedroom for several minutes after the shooting, looking at the bodies of the 2 people who had destroyed her life. Later, she would describe feeling a sense of relief, as if a terrible weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Her revenge was complete, or so she thought. Do you believe Betty's claim that she only meant to talk? The evidence suggests otherwise, but Betty maintained this story throughout her trials and continues to claim it was self-defense to this day. Betty drove home and called 911 approximately 30 minutes after the shooting. Her voice on the recording was calm and matter-of-fact as she reported the deaths and admitted to being the shooter. She made no attempt to flee or hide evidence. When police arrived at her house, she surrendered without resistance, still wearing the clothes she had worn during the shooting. Betty thought her revenge was complete. She had no idea her real punishment was just beginning. The murder of Dan and Linda Broderick became one of the most closely watched criminal cases in San Diego history. The media coverage was intense and often sensationalized, with reporters focusing on the soap opera aspects of the case rather than the serious criminal charges involved. Betty's first trial began in October 1990, almost a year after the murders. The prosecution argued that Betty had committed premeditated murder, motivated by jealousy and revenge. They presented evidence of her threats against Dan and Linda, her purchase of the gun, and the calculated way she entered their home in the early morning hours. The defense argued that Betty was the victim of psychological abuse and that her actions were the result of extreme emotional distress caused by Dan's systematic destruction of her life. They painted her as a battered woman who had been driven to the breaking point by years of legal and emotional manipulation. The first trial ended in a hung jury. The 12 jurors were evenly split between those who saw Betty as a cold-blooded killer and those who viewed her as a victim who had been pushed too far. The public was similarly divided, with women's rights groups rallying to Betty's defense while victims' rights advocates demanded justice for Dan and Linda. During the months between trials, Betty remained in custody, unable to make bail. Her children, now orphaned and traumatized, were cared for by relatives and family friends. The older children, Kim and Lee, began speaking publicly about their mother's actions, with Kim condemning the murders and Lee offering more sympathetic support. The second trial began in September 1991, with largely the same evidence presented to a new jury. This time, the prosecution emphasized the premeditated nature of the crime and Betty's lack of remorse. They argued that regardless of what Dan had done to her, murder was not an acceptable response. The second jury found Betty guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 32 years to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 19 years. Betty showed no emotion when the verdict was read, maintaining her composure even as she was led away in handcuffs. Do you think justice was served? The answer depends on whether you view Betty as a victim or a perpetrator, a question that continues to divide public opinion more than 3 decades later. Betty Broderick is now 76 years old and remains incarcerated at the California Institution for Women in Corona, California. She has been denied parole multiple times, most recently in 2017, with her next hearing scheduled for 2024. During her parole hearings, Betty has consistently refused to show remorse for her actions, maintaining that she was defending herself against Dan's abuse. The 4 Broderick children have had varying relationships with their mother over the years. Kim Broderick wrote a book condemning her mother's actions and has testified against Betty's parole requests. Lee Broderick has been more supportive, visiting Betty in prison and advocating for her release. The 2 younger children, Danny Jr. and Rhett, have largely stayed out of the public eye but have maintained some contact with their mother. The case fundamentally changed how domestic violence and divorce law are handled in California and other states. Courts now receive better training on recognizing emotional abuse and manipulation tactics. Legal professionals are more aware of how the divorce process itself can become a weapon used by one spouse against another. The Betty Broderick case has been the subject of countless books, documentaries, television movies, and even a recent Netflix series. Each retelling tends to reflect the cultural attitudes of its time, with some portrayals sympathetic to Betty and others condemning her actions. The case remains a touchstone for discussions about domestic abuse, women's rights, and the justice system. Betty Broderick destroyed everything she once fought to protect. In her quest for revenge against Dan and Linda, she lost her children, her freedom, and any chance of rebuilding her life. The murders accomplished nothing except creating more victims and more pain. The true cost of revenge extends far beyond the immediate victims. Dan and Linda Broderick died violently, their dreams and potential cut short. The 4 Broderick children grew up without parents, traumatized by the loss of their father and the imprisonment of their mother. Extended family members and friends were forced to choose sides in a tragedy that had no winners. What lessons can we learn from this tragedy? Perhaps the most important is that revenge never truly satisfies or heals. Betty's anger and pain were real and justified. Dan's treatment of her during their divorce was cruel and manipulative. But her violent response only multiplied the suffering and destroyed any sympathy she might have received. The case also highlights the importance of recognizing emotional abuse and providing support for people going through difficult divorces. Betty felt trapped and powerless, with no one listening to her side of the story. Better intervention might have prevented the tragedy that followed. What lessons can we learn from this tragedy? Let me know in the comments below. Do you think Betty was a victim or a perpetrator? Could this tragedy have been prevented? Your thoughts and opinions help continue this important conversation about family violence and the justice system. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe to our channel for more true crime documentaries that examine the complex factors behind tragic cases. Next week, we'll be exploring another case of family betrayal that shocked a community and changed lives forever. Thank you for watching, and remember, the line between victim and perpetrator is sometimes thinner than we'd like to believe.